Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Keep Calm is Just a Snake podcast. We had a lovely mid-season intermission of our season two. Today, we have an amazing guest who is working with animal behavior, specifically with reptile and snake behavior, Lori Torrini. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thank you.
Awesome. So this is something that I know most people haven't even thought about, or even it's not even in the realm of a thought process when they think about keeping even just pet reptiles or even a bunch of different species, ball pythons or whatever have you. So we'll just kind of get rolling into this. So how'd you get started with all of this?
Well, in the zoo community and in general animal training communities, it's not all that unusual to do reptile training. Snake training is a little more rare, but within the last 5 years, it's really becoming more and more common in zoos and in the general animal training community. It's really new to pet keepers. Mm-hmm. So many dog owners and horse owners really don't train their dogs or train their horses or train their cats. Cats is a big one. People get a cat and they don't even think to train it. So I think when people get a snake or other reptile, that is not even entering their mind to train it. But cooperative care training that's done in zoos, that's now being done through fear-free pets in veterinary hospitals and grooming facilities, cooperative care that's now being done with lab animals to give animals more agency and their own behavioral outcomes and consent more to what's being done to them, works extremely well with snakes and other reptiles too. And I got started in it 4 or 5 years ago when I got a jungle carpet python that was really averse to touch and handling and fearful of people. Mm-hmm. I mean, to the extreme, not just a little bit, but she would go crazy if you tried to interact with her. Escape and avoidance and eliminating and saltatory locomotion, where she would literally push off with all her body muscles and jump from one spot to another. And I thought, this is ridiculous. This animal's terrified. She's distressed. I'm distressed. And then I took a deep breath and said, Laura, you're an animal trainer. You've been training animals for 30 years in these other professions. What would you do if this was a dog or a horse or a cat or a zoo animal? My actual degree is in zookeeping, but I hold credentials in applied animal behavior and animal training. And that's what I'm doing mostly right now. So I decided to approach her as I would a fearful horse. And I did a lot of approach and retreat. I let her passively habituate to activity in the room. I started to target train her. And we got to the point where she would orient to and follow the target out of her enclosure to temporary holding, where I could clean the enclosure and do what I needed to do. And then she would follow the target back into her enclosure and I wouldn't have to touch her. And she wasn't distressed and I wasn't distressed and we were both safe. And I thought, if I never do anything else, I'm so super happy with this. But then I started noticing, mostly on social media, that people were having similar, maybe not as extreme, but similar issues with their own snakes. And I thought, well, this was super easy to do, actually. Like, target training her was actually really easy to do. And so I started informally kind of helping people. And then there were only a handful of other people doing it and no one doing snake training full time. Like, right. The other people doing it were doing it kind of on the side. And it's just grown to now I'm working more with snakes and reptiles than I am with dogs and horses and other animals. And I would have never thought that, because I've always been heavily into training horses and dogs and doing stuff with them, and then other species as well. But I don't think anyone would have ever predicted in 2022 the main focus of what I'm doing would be snakes.
That is so crazy.
It's crazy. And I love it. And it's reinvigorated my love of animal behavior and training, because it's so exciting to work with a new species and see the results and see them interact and learn. It's just really amazing.
That's so cool. So was the jungle carpet your very first reptile? Your very first snake, I should say?
No, I had a snake. It's been maybe 25 years ago now. And then growing up, I would catch turtles and other reptiles and amphibians, and my mom would never let me keep them long, because she at least had the sense to know you can't just put it in a box and keep it in your room. So you need to let it go. It's going to die. Let it back out. Yep. So I did have a snake for a while. And then I had told my husband when I retire, I worked for the city of Colorado Springs for 21 years. I said, when I retire, I'm going to get another snake. I'm getting snakes again. And now I have like 115. So it just went crazy. I love them so much, and I'm having so much fun working with them and trying things with them to see how far I can go with the training and behavior with these different species, that I'm just really excited about it. But it went from I'm going to get another pet snake to now it's the work that I do.
Wow, that's actually a whole lot more than I thought you had, to be honest with you. How many species do you actually work with?
Oh, like 22, I think, different species. If you include the subspecies of carpet pythons, I have every subspecies of carpet python that's legal to own in the United States. And then I have the Morelia Bredli and the Morelia carinata, which is the rough-scaled pythons. So I love Morelia.
Mm-hmm.
And initially, that's what I had a lot of. That's what I have the most of, is Morelia and other pythons. But I do also have 5 boas. I have 4 rainbow boas and a leopard boa. So it's a cross between boa sigma and boa imperator. And that came from Ben Russo.
Yep.
And then I have like some corn snakes, a couple of king snakes, a hognose snake, a bull snake, and a gopher snake. I try to have some of the variety is due to, now that I'm doing this as a profession, the snake portion. I mean, I've always done animal training as a profession, but now that I'm doing snakes and behavioral consultations with snakes, I have some of the more common species because I need to be able to advise pet owners if they come to me and say my king snake this or my royal python this,
right,
my corn snake this. Well, I really need to feel like I have an in-depth knowledge of their behavior. Yep. So I have so many species because part of the species I have are I love them and I want to personally work with them. And part of the species I have are because they're common for other people to have. And when I do behavior consultations or coach them to train these other species, I need to be familiar with it. For example, I have one false water cobra, and it's not a species I would have chosen to have. However, I was coaching a grad student at West Liberty University for her master's thesis, and she was working with 27, I think, false water cobras there at the university. And they're so different from the common snakes that we all work with that they sent me one so that I could train it here as I coached her there. And it went really super well. And we actually got a paper published, like we're published now. We published that project. It got published in Animals. It's an open access journal. And it's a peer-reviewed journal that anyone can access. If you go to my website where it says where to find Lori's work, I think it's the first article I have listed. It's Williams, Torrini, and Loafman, and there's another person.
Yep, it is.
So that was really exciting.
That's so cool. That's actually the reason why I even have a couple species. Like that's why I have a bearded dragon, who does not like me whatsoever, but it does allow me to know a little bit about their behavior. So even though I'm definitely more of a snake person, I can give very limited advice or my opinion about their care or issues with those with being so popular.
And the thing is with that, unless it's a species like a false water cobra is truly a lot different than many other. But if it's a species that's more common and it's similar to other species I have, I mean, I don't need to have every species here because I don't have every zoo animal species. I don't have every breed of dog. And the important thing is I'm just coaching people on behavior and training. I know behavior science. I know animal training science. So I need you to know your animal. And I'm going to ask you a series of questions like, what does it eat? How does it perceive the world? This whole list. And then once we have that established, I can coach you or advise you. But it's really your responsibility to know your animal if you're the one that's keeping it, if you're the one that's caring for it.
Correct. So I liked that. And I found it very interesting that originally when you were talking about your jungle carpet python who was adverse to handling and interactions seemingly altogether. And a common consensus from someone who was just keeping them would say, oh, it's just afraid, or it's cage shy, or it's cage defensive. And they would start to alter they possibly would start to alter their setup. They would start to make sure that their temps and humidity and lighting and everything like that is dialed in first. Whereas you are, I'm assuming, already had a very good grasp about that setup. And so you started to address it on a behavioral point versus how I would think that many people in the hobby community industry would start to tackle it on a husbandry level.
Correct. Well, she was fearful. She was terrified.
Mm-hmm.
She had negative emotional valence with everything to do with people and, you know, being in a home. And so my job as a behaviorist and trainer is to change that negative emotional valence to a positive emotional valence. So instead of her associating bad things with people,
Mm-hmm.
I needed to get her to start associating good things with people and to feel secure in her environment and to know that nothing was going to be forced on her. And so I actually set her enclosure up in a very highly traveled space in our home.
Yeah.
But it was all enclosed except the front. And I had so many things for her to hide in and around and on and behind in there that when I first did this, I thought she had gotten out somehow. And my husband's like, there's no way she got out. That the enclosure I had her in was designed for venomous snakes. It was one of the old style Neodesha enclosures.
Yep.
And he's like, she can't get out. She's just hiding. And sure enough, you know, after a few days, I'd see her peeking out and watching what we were doing. And then after a couple weeks, she would be sitting out watching everything going on. But the difference there is she had the option to engage in the activity going on and watch it or not. And so over time, she would just be sitting at the door every day watching what was going on. And then I would start opening the door and I just leave it open. And I built a bookshelf in front of her enclosure and did all sorts of activities until she never hid. The door could be wide open and she'd sit there watching me. And that combined with the target training, where now we had a precise way to communicate with each other. The target means if you follow it and interact with it, you earn a food reinforcer. And so she learned to do that and we were good until one day she targeted out of her enclosure, got on her station and dropped the food and started roaming around the room. And then she was telling me, hey, I now feel confident and comfortable out in the open and around you. And now I find my freedom more reinforcing than that food in this moment. And so now she still does not like to be touched and handled. And over her lifetime, we can work on that.
Right.
But she does now come out of her enclosure if I open the door, and she'll climb right next to me, above me, around the room. And she's cool as long as I don't touch her. And so now that is another step over her lifetime and over our relationship that we will build on. But, you know, now she never hides. Like I'm looking at her right now. She's on the other side of the camera, just sitting there on her branch, just in the wide open. And so it was a phenomenal change in that animal, her confidence level, her understanding of human behavior and our ability to communicate with each other. And now we have a relationship that's just fine.
That's really cool. That's actually, so obviously this has to do with a lot of more commonly thought of animals, like with dogs and horses and other probably more like mammalian species and even birds as well. But that what you're talking about and building a positive relationship is also something that, you know, large monitor, tegu, and even iguana keepers have started to adapt. But I think that, you know, that's really, really cool that you took those same principles and we're starting to use it with species of animals that not even traditionally, but always have been deemed as, I guess, not on an intellectual bar with the rest of them.
Right.
I suppose.
They work in practice. And then I started researching neuropsychology. A lot of the continuing education I do is with a neuropsychologist. Mm-hmm. And I started looking at reptile brains, and they have all the same or homologous parts as other vertebrates. And vertebrates are all of us that have a spinal column. So reptiles, birds, frogs, mammals, us. And they have the same or homologous neurochemicals. So biologically, there's no reason that they can't learn. And evolutionarily, if they weren't able to learn and adapt their behavior, then they wouldn't have survived for 100 million years or however long snakes have been around.
Exactly.
Like there's no way that you survive as an organism if you can't think and learn and change your behavior based on past experiences. And so when we modify their behavior under captive management, that's what we're doing. We're setting up an environment where they're learning. And if the outcome of their behavior is positive or beneficial for them, they're going to repeat that behavior. And if it's not, then they're not going to repeat that behavior. So if they're having a displeasurable interaction with us, they're not going to want to interact with us again. Why would they?
Right. Exactly. That's definitely very true. And I know it's just really cool that, as I kind of mentioned before, I think everyone's immediate, I guess, fix or approach is to just try to dial in husbandry needs, because that's what we've all been kind of conditioned and, verbal diarrhea repeating out, that if you just dot your T's and cross your I's, and I'm pretty sure I messed that up, for your husbandry needs, of regardless of the species, you will eliminate any behavioral issues. You'll have an animal that will settle down and will eat readily for you, when that isn't always necessarily the case, where you've now proven and shown that in fact is definitely something that is a behavioral thing, that you can work to establish a relationship with animals that isn't necessarily dependent on their environment. And although obviously a safe and comforting environment is also a necessity for that.
Well, it is. I mean, obviously, if the environment's inappropriate and they're uncomfortable in their environment, they're going to try to get away from that. It's going to cause behavioral issues. Or if they have a medical condition, it's going to alter their behavior. Mm-hmm. But if they are healthy and their environment is proper, their behavior is because they are displeased or having a negative, bad experiences with something else in their environment. We're part of their environment, and we need to remember that.
Yes.
We are part of the environment is everything around us. And that's the external environment. The internal environment is our health, our how we feel inside. And so if that's all good and their habitat's good and they're still having fear, anxiety, distress, then that's being caused by something that they're afraid of in their environment that's not related to climate, and it's not related to health. And a lot of times that's us or some other stimulus that we don't understand is bothering them. Like if you've got your reptile sitting on top of your television or your speakers and the vibrations or noise is, irritating them, things like that. Or if you have another pet that the animal's averse to, like cats and snakes don't mix well, at least not in my house. So we keep them apart, but the dogs and the snakes don't seem to mind each other. So it could be something like that, but we have to remember their environment is more than their climate. It's more than what's their temperature and humidity. Yep. And do they have fresh water? The environment is literally everything going on around them.
Exactly. And I was telling a story that I have a northern pine snake, and she was kept in a 36-inch Exoterra in the living room of my house when I was still in Denver. So it was a high traffic area. There were dogs sitting. We had people over all the time, upstairs away from most of the collection. And so she was used to a lot of movement, a lot of noise, a lot of vibrations constantly. And she would just sit and watch all the time. Because she's a large adult snake, I wanted to put her into a larger enclosure. So I moved her into a 4-foot Christmas tree tub rack. But temporarily, all I could put her in was in another room. The climate was exactly the same. I made sure everything was good for her, but she just immediately got defensive.
She couldn't see out, right?
Yep,
she
exactly.
Couldn't see out.
And that's what it was. It wasn't the noise. It wasn't the traffic. She wanted to see. And so she stopped eating. Her behavior entirely changed. And I said, fine, put her back into that smaller enclosure so she could see. And so because of that, I went, so that's the issue. That was the problem. That was the negative change. And so since then, she's been now moved into a 4-foot, it is a melamine enclosure, but a 4-foot melamine enclosure with a glass opening front. And now she's back to her normal behavior when she was in that smaller cage. But
the ability for them to see us is just as important as us to be able to see them. Us learning their behavior and being able to see them is important, but they need to be able to see us and our activity and to know what's normal for us. like what activities we're doing that have nothing to do with them. And they learn to recognize, oh, she's doing that. I bet she's about to open my door. I bet she's about to feed me. I bet she's about to start a training session. They learn what our behavior means too. And imagine if you're in a room that you can't see out of and you hear noises outside and you sense vibrations outside, but you don't know what those are. That is going to be nerve-wracking, and it's nerve-wracking for animals too. It makes a huge difference if they can see what's going on. It makes a huge difference if they know what's about to happen, which is why good communication and training makes the relationship go so much smoother. Even for times when it's an emergency or they have to go to the vet or there's a need to force handling, which I do very seldom, but I have a signal for that. I have a no choice signal that I don't use for training, I don't use for exercise, I don't use for other experiences. But if I have to hold them, I have a no choice signal that I give them first so they know what's about to happen. Because nobody likes surprises. Nobody likes ambiguity. We all like to know what's about to happen. And even if we know what's about to happen might not be something we want, we deal with it better if we know it's coming. And the animals are no different. The snakes are no different.
Right. Exactly.
So like the jungle carpet python, she doesn't like to be touched or handled, but if I had to take her to the vet or we had to evacuate, I have a no choice signal that I give her, and then she knows that I'm going to pick her up, and she's not going to be happy about it, but she's less distressed and manifest that in a less crazy way when she knows it's about to happen than if I just open the door and reach in and start trying to grab her and she's trying to get away and cling on to stuff.
That absolutely makes sense. It's very similar to how, say, like they do the tap training with monitors or large constrictors, where sometimes they'll tap on sometimes one side of the enclosure, which is that's the interaction side, and they'll give a tap, or sometimes they'll physically touch the snake. Like that's what I do with my retic, is I open up the door and pat her a couple times and say, okay, we're coming out now. This is fun interaction. You're going into the other container while we clean your enclosure because you're an idiot and you keep eating coconut coir for your substrate. So I have to change your paper every single day. That kind of a thing, which is very similar to what you are doing, but you're definitely taking it farther.
Communicating to the animal what's about to happen reduces fear, anxiety, and distress, and it makes everything safer during your interactions together. So communicating to the animal, we're going to do a training session and you have the opportunity to earn food reinforcement, versus we're going to do a training session and you have the opportunity to free roam afterwards. They learn that. I mean, I have a different cue for each of those things, but they can learn those different cues, just like they have a cue for, I'm going to pick you up. You have no choice to opt out, because most of our interactions are choice-based and they can always opt out. So if they don't feel like coming out, if they don't feel like training, they can opt out, and that's fine. I'm not going to force them. But if it's a need, like a vet evacuation, something like critical, the dogs just slammed into your enclosure and broke the glass on the front. Okay, this is a need. You have to come out. I have to hold you. I am taking you out and we're doing this. I have a signal so that they know that that's going to happen.
That makes a lot of sense. So I do have a quick question. With the food reinforcement for the wanted behavior during the training sessions or whatever it is, how exactly do you go about doing that? Because I know that eating and then moving right after having even a small meal, because I'm assuming that's what it is, it's a much smaller prey item than what would be considered a normal meal.
Well, it depends on how many repetitions I'm doing. I don't feed them more often. If I'm using food reinforcers for training, we do the training around when they would normally eat. So I don't feed them more often. And then during that training session, if I decide ahead of time if I'm going to do 1 repetition or 3, and I just make sure that the meal is an appropriate size, whether it's 1 prey item or 3 prey items, it's all going to add up to the same amount of grams.
Okay.
And, I've obviously checked with my veterinarian and the 2 previous veterinarians I used, and they're like, that's no problem as long as you're not overfeeding.
Right.
It doesn't matter if it's in 2 mice or 1 mouse that they're getting the 50 grams or the 75 grams. They're getting that amount in the feeding and it's fine. So I just make sure that I plan how many reps I want to do. And my vet actually said it's a folklore that handling them after eating causes regurgitation. I mean, unless you're squeezing your snake, unless you're grabbing them and squeezing the food out of them, they consume prey in the wild, and then they have to survive to get back to their dens or back to where they sleep. And they have to climb and traverse terrain and escape from predators all during that time. So it isn't activity after eating that causes regurgitation. It's typically a medical issue. My vet says if your snake's regurgitating, it's usually a medical issue, with the exception of there are a few species where it's a part of their natural history. If they think a predator's after them, they'll regurgitate. Or false water cobras tend to eat things first. If it turns out not to be food, they regurgitate it right away before it's even gone very far.
Right.
But most of the species you're going to keep as a pet, like pythons, boas, corn snakes, king snake, they're not just going to spontaneously regurgitate. Now, if they are so distressed by what you're doing that's causing regurgitation, then you need to reevaluate the relationship prior to that. Because if they're normally not stressed by handling, or not stressed by being on an activity station, or not stressed by being weighed, they're not going to suddenly be stressed by that activity just because they ate. I mean, it's not going to change.
Right.
If they're used to being on an activity tree and they're comfortable and relaxed with that and find it reinforcing, that's not going to change because they just ate. So people are mismatching the reasons why the snake's regurgitating. Right. And if your snake is comfortable and relaxed with an activity on an empty stomach, they're going to be comfortable and relaxed with that activity on a full stomach, and it's not going to cause them to regurgitate the meal.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. And actually, I hadn't even thought about the regurgitating thing. It was always just a stress reducer, is what I was told, and again, is constantly told again, to where it's not so much a risk of the regurgitation, it's just added stress after eating a meal, is where I hear a lot of the conversation.
Stressed about something, then you need to address the reason why they're stressed about that activity.
Correct.
And that is separate from whether they have an empty stomach or a full stomach.
Right. Which is what you're saying makes absolute sense, it totally makes sense. So if you target train out onto an activity tree and then they're fed, then that makes perfect sense. And then I'm assuming that you target train back into the enclosure, or sometimes you actually handle and put back in.
It depends. Some of the snakes will just go back in on their own. Some of them will, I'll target them back in if I don't have time to wait for them. And then some of them prefer to go ahead and eat and then do their normal activities. Like they'll roam around the room, they'll use an activity station, and then when they're done, then I go get them and put them away, just like normal. So everything's just like normal. The snake tells me what they feel like doing after they've eaten. Like that's up to them.
Right.
Most of my snakes that have a routine where not all of my snakes come out, but I have many that come out regularly, and they'll roam around the room, and they have activity stations they use. And so if that's normal for them, and I learned this several years ago, because people always tell you, well, leave them alone after they eat.
Right.
And it's not up to us to make that decision for them. The snake knows what it wants to do. And if the snake is pacing inside its enclosure because you're not letting it out and it's used to being out, it's distressed because you're not letting it out like normal. And it's using all this physical activity. It's pacing on the glass, it's nose pushing. And as soon as I open the door, it comes out and it goes and finds its favorite spot and climbs up and sits, which is more distressing. Like, how do you want the snake behaving on a full stomach? So the snake's going to tell you what they want to do, and it's not up to us to decide, well, you ate, you're not coming out tonight, but then they're completely distressed inside the enclosure because I'm not letting them out.
Right.
Which the opposite's true too. If your snake never comes out, and that's not a routine activity for them, after they eat is not the time to start like taking them out and teaching them that they can come out,
Right.
because that's
Exactly.
going to distress them.
Right. So it really is kind of it. I'm not even kind of, but it's learning your animal and learning its behaviors and figuring out what they are telling you versus just husbandry dogma, essentially.
Right.
Which
Right.
is what I think more people really need to start thinking about, both small and large scale, is just watch your animals.
Correct.
And they'll tell you. It's, because a lot of the people that I have interactions with, either through the educational programs or they're wanting to get their first reptile pet, the very first thing, especially if they're younger, their parents will ask, well, do they bite? And I'll always say, well, anything with a mouth will bite you. I bet you've bitten your mom hundreds of times. But it's working with any type of animal, you start to learn and understand their body language. And to the point where, if you're, watching your animals and you understand them, if you're going to receive a bite, it's going to be your fault, because
Yes.
either you confused the animal or you ignored what it was trying to tell you.
Correct. It is if you get bitten, there's been some miscommunication between you and the animal. You ignored its body language, you ignored what it was telling you, or you weren't thinking and some kind of mistake happened. Like, oh, I'm holding a rat in my hand and I forgot this snake was out exercising.
Mm-hmm.
And, gee, now it's around the rat and my hand,
Yep,
things
exactly.
like that. I mean, humans do stupid things. And the snakes don't really give us a lot of space for error, because they're going to tell us if we're doing something wrong. But yeah, if you get bitten, it's because you're not reading their body language correctly. You don't know your animal. There's a miscommunication that's occurred, or the animal is clearly telling you to stay away and you're ignoring that and you're intruding into their personal space anyway.
Right.
Or you startle them. And sometimes we startle them because we don't, like, maybe I think they're in their sky hide, but they're actually in their ground hide. And I go to change the water and I startled the snake because it was laying under the water dish and it strikes out without thinking. Things like that can happen, but there's a reason. They just don't expend the energy to bite you because they hate you.
Yep, exactly. Like that happened this morning, where I have a pair of legless lizards, and the female always likes to pull the cord out of her UVB light. And so this morning, as I'm going around checking to see if any of the females laid eggs or anything, I see, oh great, she pulled it out again. And I go and I start to readjust it. One of the female black-headed pythons is in the cage above them. And so when I went to go turn that on, she must have still been asleep or not been fully aware that the lights had kicked on. And so when I popped up, there's my big worm in her face, and she absolutely reacted to that, to which I thought she was going to break through the glass.
Right.
But that is
they can get startled. I think it's easy for us to startle snakes or any reptile that doesn't have eyelids, because their eyes appear open.
Right.
Many times they're sleeping, especially if it's a species that sleeps out in the open, like many of the Morelia.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm looking at some right now that are, I know, sound asleep, but they don't look like it to just a normal person because they're out on a ledge with their eyes open.
Yep.
But, if we try to move around them and we suddenly wake them up and startle them, like if you suddenly wake me up and startle me, you're probably getting punched.
Yep, that's that flight or flight response. That's how many videos have we seen of the jump scare and then the guy gets hit in the face?
Yes. So the snakes aren't any different. So we need to make sure before we start an interaction, whether that's I'm just going to spot clean or change the water, or I'm going to open the door and let them out, or I'm going to start a training session, that they are fully awake and aware, and that they've had a chance to acclimate to what's going on. And you can tell if you observe their body language when they go from sleep to awake, or they're half out of it, to suddenly, oh, I know what we're doing, we're training, or oh, I know what we're doing, we're eating, or oh, you're going to open the door, okay, I'm ready to come out. Like, they'll let you know that, but you've got to be able to see your animal and take the time to learn their body language.
We're going to make a lot of rat keepers very upset.
Well, and I had, unfortunately, one of my Morelia died of lymphosarcoma earlier this year. And, if I wasn't visually seeing her day in and during the night and watching her behavior, she would have been in physical distress probably for much longer, because you can't see that in a tub or a rat. If you can't see your animal, you can't see them exhibiting pain behaviors. You can't see them struggling to breathe. You know, you can't see those behaviors if you can't see your animal.
Yep.
So, I mean, I notice their behavior when they're first waking up. And I've had people say, well, I just happened to be watching my snake and the head started twitching, and then like he yawned, and do you think he's got something wrong with them? I'm like, no, they often do that when they're just waking up. Like,
yep.
Like they have these little head twitches, and sometimes they yawn and they jerk a little bit. It almost looks like they have a neurologic issue, but it's just them like waking up and getting their senses about them and becoming fully alert and aware. But if you don't watch your snake and happen to see them when they routinely wake up, you're not going to know that. And then you see it and you're like, oh my God, something's wrong with my snake. It's twitching.
That's hilarious. That's actually one that I haven't heard. Like, at some point when we keep reptiles, we all become everyone's reptile person. Like, there's a guy for that, and we all become the reptile guy. That's actually one of the ones I haven't quite heard yet. I've heard like, oh, does it have neuro? But it's usually because it's like a boa, or it's a champagne or a spider ball python or something, or a jag. And I go, well, I mean, yeah.
Well, let me try and explain this. When they're hovering over an open space and part of their body's anchored and they're in an S coil, but that S coil's over nothing, and they tense their body to hold themselves up or to continue to move forward, they'll shake and they'll have tremors. But that's their muscles working. It's not because they have a neurologic issue. Like, neurologic issues are very easy to differentiate from normal other body.
It's true.
And then I've had people ask me about snakes sneezing, and they can't actually sneeze because they don't have a diaphragm, but they do a behavior that sounds like sneezing. And oftentimes it's because they're clearing their throat. Maybe they've got some stuck shut in their nares and it's a way to blow it out. So I learned not to panic about that. If I happen to see it, they'll do it a few times, and then that's usually the end of it.
Yep.
You know, if they do that and then you're noticing other things like bubbles and too much fluid in the mouth, and of course, then that's something else. But they do something similar to sneezing that's normal. But I've had people freak about that.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. There's a lot of normal snake behaviors that even people who have had them for a while just don't quite notice or understand, or just because they haven't seen it yet. Although technically, at least that is a good thing, that they are watching and learning about their animals. And so when they see something new for the first time, they're not disregarding it. So that is a good response, I suppose.
Right.
So I had kind of a question, because I know what they are, but I don't think quite too many people know. What is an activity station for a snake?
It's going to be dependent upon your individual species, natural history, and biology. So I have a lot of snakes that are from the Morelia complex, carpet pythons, Brettles pythons. I have a Ruskell python. I also have royal pythons. I love pythons, but then the corn snakes and king snakes and bull snakes and some of the colubras will also climb. So a lot of my activity stations, I have the 2 reticulated pythons, the super dwarf retics. They love to climb. So a lot of my activity stations include climbing things. I actually have a large parrot stand that's like 6 feet tall, maybe even 7 feet tall. It almost goes to the ceiling, and it's got all these branches and things on it. It's meant for a large bird, but I use it for the snakes to climb on, and I've added netting and ropes to that. And then I have 2 cat stands that are wooden, not the kind with the carpet on them, but the kind that have wooden platforms on them. And I've added like ropes and perching and extra things to those. And I've added wheels to the bottom so that I can wheel those up to some of the enclosures that are up high, and the snakes can come right out onto them, and then they can climb around. For some of the snakes that aren't going to stay on those activity stations and keep themselves occupied climbing, I have some soft-sided dog exercise pins that are like these round fabric crates that zip up, like it's kind of like a tent, and it has a top and a bottom. And I put stuff in there like different substrates. So like for my Western or Plains hognose snake, if I put her in the exercise tent, I'll put several different substrates in there for her to burrow in and investigate, or I'll crumple up paper and put in there, or I'll take like a bunch of fruit parts that I was going to throw away and I'll put it in a Tupperware container. I'll sit that in there for her to crawl through. So it really depends on the species of snake that you have. My one of my super dwarf retics really likes to swim. So if I put a big water container in the activity tent, he'll swim in it. Or you have to know your snake's natural history, and that's your starting point. Now, because they're under captive management, there are going to be things that they're going to encounter with us they would not necessarily encounter in the wild, and that's okay. And some of the snakes will surprise you and use those things. So my Western hognose snake will climb. She will use the climbing stations. I think they probably climb a little bit in the wild, but it's not a huge part of their behavioral repertoire.
Yeah.
But she will climb up and down the activity stand here because she has it available and it's something for her to do.
Mm-hmm.
So you start with what you know the species is likely to engage with, but then you can try novel things with them and see if they use them or not.
So it's essentially different things that they can interact with and enrich with in theoretically a controlled area or environment for them to exercise, interact with, and encounter outside of their 24/7 enclosures.
Right. And they're exercising their mind and their physical body.
Right.
But I do want to point out that I don't let small species of snakes or baby snakes just freely roam around or be loose in some of these areas.
Mm-hmm.
I prefer medium to bigger snakes because I can safely let them loose in a room and they're not going to get anywhere they shouldn't. But like a little baby corn snake, there's no way. So if you have an African house snake, I don't know, some of baby snakes, like baby colubrids are tiny, like pencil thin. So I feel like I shouldn't have to tell you this, but those aren't appropriate to just let out of their enclosures. In those cases, I get maybe a big tub, like a storage tub that's a big one, and I put things in there for them to do, and I can seal the lid, or I can stand above it, like maybe even a cardboard box. But I stay right there with them and I can stand above it and watch them so they don't climb out or get away. I mean, you still have to ensure their safety. And unfortunately for smaller snakes, tiny snakes, that's going to be tougher to do than like a python. Mm-hmm. So you don't just indiscriminately let every snake out to freely roam. You've got to make sure the environment is safe for them to be where they're at. And not every snake is going to want to come out. So none of these snakes that roam that I let out are forced to come out. They're given the option to come out. And if they don't want to come out, I'm not taking them out. I'm not forcing them to come out. The doors are open and the activity stations are nearby, or the doors are open and the snakes know how to get to where they're going because they've done it so many times. But if they choose not to come out, I'm not forcing them to come out. If I have to force them out because of a need, then we have a whole nother protocol for that.
Right. So for someone who, listening to this and they go and they read a lot of your articles and they find like, I think you did one with like Animal at Home. I think you were on, I think you were part of a roundtable and maybe a couple other ones with him who he does an amazing job and asks much better questions than I do. But for someone who, found you, listened to this podcast, whatever may have you, and they decided they wanted to start target training their pet emperor otter, how would you go about giving an example of how they can start to do that?
So my boa imperator cross was quite shy when I got him. So with him, I started it in his enclosure. So I just started pairing. I have a target right here. Let me show you. So this is an example of a target. And so I pair the target with food initially for him. So if my hand is the food, I just literally put the target behind it. Okay. So there's 3 reactions a snake could have to the target. They could be afraid of it.
Right.
They could be curious about it and go up to it right away, or it could just be neutral to them. It doesn't mean anything to them, so they just ignore it. If they're afraid of it, when you start, then you're going to feed your snake and keep the target out, far away. Like you're just going to hold it, so it becomes something that's always with you when you feed. But if they're afraid of it, you're not going to put it close to them. You're just going to gradually get it closer and closer. If they're not afraid of it, and it's a neutral stimulus, or they're curious about it, then you pair the target with the food. They take the food. You do that 2 or 3 times, and they get used to always seeing that target with the food. So then maybe the 4th time, and these are just, it depends on the individual.
Right.
But just say the 4th time I show just the target, and the snake looks at it, and then I give the food. And then the next time I show the target, and the snake looks at it and comes towards it a little bit, and then I give the food. And so you're building a behavior of, now the snake starts to incrementally understand that wherever the target is, if it moves towards it, it gets reinforced.
Right.
And then I can start building other behaviors using that. That's mostly how I use the target. And if it's a shy snake, a snake that's not confident, a snake that's not already coming out on its own for other activities, I start that target training in the enclosure. Like with the jungle carpet python, we started right in her enclosure and eventually got her out of the enclosure until she was going back and forth. But I have some snakes that before their first meal here are already coming out. They're just that confident, where they came out at their old house and I open the door and they're roaming around the floor. Then I could start the target training anywhere because they're already comfortable and relaxed wherever they're at. And so then I just start the training wherever they happen to be. But you can certainly, the safest thing for most pet owners is going to be to start it in the enclosure. And if they're fearful of the target, you can just keep it with you until you're able to get it closer and closer. Or you can take the target off the stick and leave it in the enclosure with them to habituate to on their own. That's called passive habituation. If you do that with an item, you need to put that item somewhere off by itself, where if the animal's truly afraid of it, it doesn't have to engage with the item, and it's not going to keep it from getting to resources like hides, food, water, whatever. So you put it off in the corner, and then the snake over time can eventually interact with it if they choose to, but it isn't going to keep them from using the rest of their enclosure. So those are 2 ways that you can get a fearful snake used to the target. But you just pair the target with food until pretty soon they understand wherever the target is. If they go to that location and they touch the target or do whatever it is that you want them to do in relation to the target, that's when they get reinforced.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Now there's a second use for a target. Hang on one second. Inara, be quiet, please. The second use for the target is literally just as a signal that they're going to eat.
Right.
So I have one snake that I use a target that just means you're getting fed. That's it. Like, we don't ask for any other behaviors with it. It's just to let them know you're getting fed now. And if you don't see this target, you're never getting fed if this target's not there. And in that case, I always pair the target with food. Like, I never unpair it because I'm only using it as a signal to communicate they're going to eat. And that's with a particular snake we have here that just is crazy, thinks everything's like, it's a children's python, and he just has this overactive feeding drive.
Yep.
And so for him, it's helped tremendously, because now if I go move around him and this target's not there, he doesn't get in that state where he's like going towards all the movement and striking, because he's learned over the years, if I don't see that blue target, I'm not getting fed, so I might as well save my energy. So you can also use it for that, but those are 2 different uses. It's important to understand that.
Right.
And so if you plan to eventually use the target to like get them to go on a scale or get them to go in and out of their enclosure, then you need to unpair that target from the food within the first several sessions, if possible, so that they don't get fixated on target food, target food, target food. Right. Because then it just becomes habit. I see the target, I strike. I see the target, I strike. And that's what happens with a lot of so-called cage aggression, is if you're only interacting with the snake and they only see you when you're feeding. At first, that was a goal-directed behavior. Oh, they opened my tub or they opened my door, and then food appeared, and I worked to get over there to it and take it. But after like 50 times of that, it's habit now. And habit is associated with a whole different part of the brain than goal-directed behavior. So now it just becomes habit. The rack door opens, I strike. The rack door opens, I strike. The door opens, I strike. The door opens, I strike. Because it's become habit, because you're only opening, feeding, opening, feeding, opening, feeding. So you've created that issue if that's happening. You know, we've created that issue if we allow that to happen. If we don't make sure that we're differentiating, this means one thing and this means another. I have another target I use that means that they can come out and explore and there's not going to be any food involved. So it's not, it doesn't even look like it's a different color target. It's a different shape target. So when they see that target's been paired with an open door so many times that when they see that target, they know the door's going to open and they can come out if they want.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So you can pick these different cues and you can use a target, you can use an index card, you can use a station. Like I have one snake that basically targets a little tub station. So I set that outside of the enclosure and she comes out into it to get fed. And so basically the tub is the target in that case. Mm-hmm. The bull snake, she has an activity stand on wheels because she's up high and I wheel it up there and she knows that her door's going to open and she can come out if she wants. And one of several things can happen. She might get fed. She might get just to exercise. She might get handled. She might get moved to an exercise tent. But that's enough positive reinforcement that no matter which of those things happens, she's okay with it. And normally she still comes out when I roll the activity stand up. So that's her signal that she can come out. And then one of maybe 4 things is going to happen. And she doesn't necessarily know which one on that day, but it becomes very clear, you know, after she comes out.
Makes sense. So I know that this is definitely something that needs to be thought out and addressed more often, which is they're all individuals and you can't necessarily classify typical behavior with a species in particular. But that is where we kind of start from the ground up, is with their natural history and
Correct.
Generally consensus of behavior. Have you noticed any species specific behaviors or even atypical behavior with any?
Oh, yeah, I can tell you that the smaller the gene pool, the smaller the genetic diversity, mm-hmm. the smaller the behavioral diversity there's going to be within that species. So they're still going to all be individuals with slightly individual temperaments and personalities. And temperament's innate. It's something organisms are born with. So when you're hatched or born, you tend to be shy or bold. You tend to be proactive or reactive. And that's just kind of how you are. And then through experience and learning, your personality, your individual personality develops. So there are species that have limited genetic diversity, limited gene pools,
right,
that are more behaviorally similar across that species. So like Morelia bredli, you're going to have some outliers, but 99% of the time, I could tell you if you randomly picked a bredli, it's probably going to do X, Y, and Z. You know, You're probably going to give it these things and it's going to be content and it's going to have well-being and you're going to have a good relationship. But if you have a species that has a huge amount of diversity in the gene pool, so royal pythons, for example, they're still being imported. So you're having wild genetics interbred with the captive genetics, and then so many people all over the world are producing them in such large numbers. There's going to be more of a difference in their personalities than say in a Morelia bredli. So for me to predict, if you randomly pick out a royal python, I can't randomly say, oh, it's definitely going to like these 5 things, because you might by chance get one that's really bold and curious and confident. I have a couple like that here. But you might also get one that's super fearful and hides all the time and is scared of everything and super reactive and you never see.
Yep.
And then you might get one that strikes, which isn't that common in the species, but I've run into some that do as a defensive behavior. And then there's going to be this whole spectrum in between. So it's more difficult to predict just randomly what they're going to be like. And that's why it's so important to work with the breeder before you get one, because the breeder should know the personality of that individual snake or hatchling and whether it's going to be well adapted or not to live in the environment for which you intend it to live in. Right. So if you're a rack breeder and you do nothing else but keep it in a tub that's got a water dish and substrate, you're preparing that animal to succeed in a life where it lives in a rack with a water dish and substrate. You're not preparing that animal to succeed in a pet home where there's going to be other pets and there's going to be kids and there's going to be humans that want to hold me and there's going to be all of this visual stimulation and all of this noise. You're not preparing it for that.
Right.
You've prepared it to succeed to live in a rack. You haven't prepared it to succeed to live in a pet home. And so it's really important that you discuss this with breeders. Some are going to naturally be more resilient about making that transition than others. And some are just going to be so distressed by that stress reaches a toxic level and it causes irreparable detrimental impact to the animal. And they're never going to succeed in that circumstance. So,
and that
corn snakes can be that way too. Corn snakes are still bred with wild corn snakes. And there's so many different lines and people breeding them that I've noticed that also within our corn snake population. Makes sense. Some are super bold and eager and like climb right out onto you, and others are like, oh my gosh, I'm hiding until you leave the room. So again, that's another example of a species with a lot of genetic diversity, which is good usually for health because they're less apt to get cancers and maybe other health conditions. Right. But you're also going to have so much behavioral diversity that you really need to investigate the individual animal that you're getting so that you're not disappointed with the animal once you bring it home. It needs to be ready to succeed in the environment you expect it to be in, whether that's a research facility, a zoo, a home where it's going to be a pet, or whether it's another breeder.
Yep,
because exactly. If you take a snake, like if you took one of my snakes that's lived with all this freedom and agency and enrichment and activity, and you put it in a rack with a water dish and substrate, it's going to go crazy. It's going to nose push. It's going to develop maladaptive behavior, stereotypies. It's not going to adapt well. And there's 2 research studies that have been done that animals that have never had a stimulating environment deal better with moving to a more stimulating environment than animals that are used to a lot of agency and stimulation going to a more deprived environment.
Yeah.
Because they're used to having all that. So they deal with it worse than the animals, who've never been exposed to enrichment at all. And the same with agency. Animals who've had a lot of choice and control in their life and a lot of agency or perceived control, they do worse when that's taken away than animals that never had that ability in the first place. Yep. So it's also important to remember any change is stressful. So whether you're going from a worse environment to a better one or a better environment to a worse one, it doesn't matter which direction you're going. If it's a change from what you've always known, it will be stressful. So we have animals that are sanctuary that obviously they're in a better circumstance than where they came from. And we know that, but they only knew that other environment. So when they get here, it's super stressful at first. Yep. Because it's a change from everything they've ever known. And we have to keep that in mind and try to make that transition go smoothly and as smoothly as possible and mitigate that transition stress. I feel like with snakes, it's easy because if they came from a rack breeder, you can buy a shoebox tub and set it up with a water dish and substrate and put the lid on and cut a hole in the top and stick it in a big enriched environment. And that snake can learn to come out when they feel like it. Like they can, they can stay in that little shoebox their whole life if they want. But if they want to come out and explore the environment at large, they can. And they can do it in their own time when they're confident and when they're ready. And it makes the transition go smoothly. So I always tell people, try to mimic the environment the animal came from, as long as it's safe, as long as it didn't come from a neglectful environment where it was being harmed. Right. Try to mimic the conditions and gradually change them over to how you're going to keep them. Because drastic sudden change is stressful no matter what it is, no matter if it's better or not. It's going to be stressful because it's a drastic change from what you knew.
Yep. Which is definitely something I always end up kind of being a little bit at odds with, just because of like my general husbandry practices, where most of the time I get animals that are either from breeders, so that it's usually very minimalistic keeping, or they are rescues or surrenders, but they immediately go into quarantine, which is very bare bones, paper towel, hide, water dish, that's it. And so I always feel like I'm just causing undue stress and anxiety for, you know, for anything that isn't a boa. They go into a 60 to 90-day quarantine. Boas 6 months or longer with a lot more blood testing. And so I always feel really bad when I know they came from, like, if it's a surrender and it was a pet, and I feel bad that they are going into a smaller enclosure with nothing for them to interact with also very little interaction from me for a while. I just feel really bad. It's like I'm absolutely going backwards.
Yeah.
Then go forward again.
I mean, what I have learned to do in those circumstances is use plastic stuff, cardboard stuff, PVC stuff to still give them stuff to do in quarantine. And that's stuff that I can throw away or I can sterilize. So
that makes a lot of sense.
So like plastic butter dishes, peanut butter jar, you know, things you're going to throw away anyway, clean them out, put them in there. Because then it's still stuff for them to climb on and in and through and investigate, but it's stuff you can throw away. Or like with PVC perching, you can sterilize that. You can disinfect that.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah.
And reuse it. So I still try to give them as much to do in quarantine as I can, but it's all stuff that like you can just throw away or you can sterilize easily.
That makes sense.
It's not going to be wood and logs and plants and stuff that's organic. It's going to be plastic bins and plastic containers and cardboard boxes and things like that.
Right. Cardboard kind of scares me, but I do really like the idea of just having small, essentially disposable things that they can interact with.
Cardboard you can throw away, and I'm still going to notice if they eliminate on it or they regurge on it. I guess it might be harder to see mites or something if it's really dark brown cardboard, but a lot, you know, like anything, use your best judgment.
Right, exactly.
What you're putting in there with them. But I like cardboard because you can throw it away. You're not going to reuse it. You were probably going to throw it away anyway.
Makes sense.
So as long as you're not afraid they're going to eat it. Then...
I have some snakes that I don't like to advocate for paper towels, butcher paper as substrate, but I have a couple that I have to because they continue to ingest substrate no matter. Like I even had one that I did try to station. It was one of my Emperors. I tried to station them away to where she would always come up, she would always respond there, and she would always take the rat on that station. She wouldn't get it until she got there, and she figured that out very quickly. But she would always pull it back to the very other end.
Yes.
And then she didn't like to eat it entirely outside of it, and so, meh.
Yes, I do have a couple that will do that. They'll come out almost all the way with their whole body onto a tub or a station, but then as soon as they have the food, they snatch it back like a turtle head. Yep. And they go back into their hide or wherever they're at. So in those cases, if it's a huge health concern, you have to get them to station all the way out. Like they don't get it till their tail's out too.
Mm-hmm.
And then they have to eat it on that station, and then they can go back in when they're done. Of course, you have to work up to that and make sure they're comfortable with that through each approximation. But yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yep. So it's because I don't necessarily always have the time available to do that. I just will interact with those animals a little bit more often than others, to where they'll be, you know, the stories of like, oh, it's my ball python hanging out with me while I clean and do stuff like that. It's that she's hanging out with me while I'm interacting with the other boas. And
you mentioned time.
Yeah.
And that made me think of a really important point, because we're talking about all this stuff. I recommend interacting with your snake when they're normally active and awake, like not waking them up in the middle of their natural sleep period and expecting them to do things. They're not going to be happy about that. And also, if you're observing their behavior, you need to observe their behavior during the period when they're naturally awake and active. You can't watch them during their sleep period and think, oh, well, all they ever do is coil on that rock, or all they ever do is sit in their hide. You don't know what they're doing during that period of time when they're naturally awake and active if you're not watching them. Yep. And if that is the time when you're at work or you're at school or you're sleeping, then set up a camera so that you can see what they're actually doing. Because I swear I have snakes, huge snakes, and I look at them when they're sleeping and think, man, they're like, that enclosure looks ginormous around them and they look so small. And then they wake up and they start moving around. And I'm like, man, they need a bigger enclosure. I need to invest in a bigger cage for them.
Yep, so, that's where I'm at, where I'm sitting there looking on like, I don't have $5,000 right now, but I need like 10 cages.
So
like
you
now.
Get a different perspective of your animal when you're watching them when they're normally awake and active. You can't just watch them at one point in their life, and you can't take that one snapshot of when you see them and think their whole life is about that.
And I think that's a big misconception, or I guess you could call it like, kind of self-imposed ignorance, to where they're told that and then they just go, well, that's it all the time, always. Right. And then
if you have a crepuscular species or a nocturnal species that's mostly awake and active late in the evening or at night, but you're only watching them during the day, you think all they ever do is sleep. You think all they ever do is sit there on that rock or in that hide.
Exactly.
And then you turn the lights off at 6 p.m. and you go home or you go to bed, and you don't know what they're doing all night during the period of time when for them it's natural to be active. They could be exhibiting stereotypies. They could be painful, in distress. You don't know what they're doing. They could be trying to get out. You have no idea if you don't put a camera on them or make the effort to stay up and watch them.
Yep, exactly. And that's why, I am a breeder. I do use racks, but that's why I try to use larger racks. That's why I try to use tubs that are very clear as I can get. I don't like the solid color, or I don't even really like the opaque ones. So that way, at least they get a 12-hour photo period, where they don't necessarily always get the ultraviolet light spectrums that I would love to be able to give all of them. But at least they get a photo period, and then that allows them to kind of figure out when I'm in and around. It's why I've also tried to do adjust my feeding times, even sometimes with a different species, where some of the colubrids I'll feed in the morning. And then for a lot of the boids, they get fed in the afternoon into the evening. And that usually means that I get better feeding responses because they're awake. I get to actually see what they're doing more than just like me pulling them up out from under their hides and then checking them like that. It allows me to actually be able to see what they're doing.
It is interesting that even though pythons are normally crepuscular or awake a lot in the evening or at night, I have a couple that I can tell people probably fed during the day, because I offer them food at night when I'm feeding the others, and they look at me like, I don't know what to do with that. And then I feed them during the day and they like take it like that. And I'm like, somebody fed you all the time during the day before, which is fine if that's what the snake's used to and that's what they've been conditioned to. But it's helpful to know that. That's why the more questions you ask the breeder and the more the breeder can tell you about the snake before you bring it home, the better that transition is going to go. Because like, with rescues, sometimes you get no information, right? So you're just trying to figure it out. You're like, I have no clue. So let's just start trying stuff and see what this snake prefers, see what it likes, see what it does when. Because oftentimes when they're relinquished, the previous owners don't want to give you any information, or maybe it's been seized by law enforcement and they don't have the information and they just dump it off with you.
Yep.
And it's like, here's your snake. Okay. What do we know about it? Nothing,
Exactly. It's okay. All the joys.
Yeah.
Well, I know for a fact that we can continue on for probably several more hours. But with the Zoom call, we've now hit again for the third time. We're running on fumes again. So we'll have to either start up another one, or we'll probably use this to come to a natural conclusion.
I'm happy to come back, and we're local to each other. So maybe sometime we could also meet up and do something. I don't know, but it's rare that I actually talk to someone else who lives in Colorado.
Yep. Colorado's kind of weird. Colorado's weird for reptiles, but I would absolutely love to be able to come up and actually see in person all of the really cool things that you're doing with your animals.
Or if you're going to be at an expo, maybe I could just go and we could chat in person or something.
Sure. Yeah, that'd be great. I know there's one coming up in the springs this fall that I am under obligation to talk to the guy who puts it on about potentially doing some educational presentations at that one, because I haven't worked with him yet.
I did an educational presentation for one in Colorado Springs prior to the pandemic. It was at the Colorado Springs City Auditorium. Mm-hmm. And I don't remember who was putting that on, but they invited me to come and speak, and I did like a lecture on snake training, and actually a lot of people, there were like 40 people listening that came and sat down. So I'm always happy to do that again. I don't very often get asked to do that, even from the local people, because I think they are like, snake training, what's that? Like, we don't get it. So,
right.
You know, but these people, whoever put that one on before, asked me to come, and I was happy to do it. Mm-hmm. So I'm always happy to do that. If it's local, I don't necessarily like leaving Colorado, but if it's local, I'm very open to doing it.
Then I might hit you up with that, because that's essentially what I do for the Show Me Snake shows. Is I'm unofficial like educational coordinator for the Colorado shows there. So might hit you up with that, because I always like to have a diversity of people presenting.
There's one that's coming up in the Denver area, and they said they were going to have presentations. So I reached out and said, hey, I'm local. I'm happy to do a presentation.
Yeah.
They said, oh, well, who are you and what can you do? And I explained, and I sent them my website, and then I never heard from them again.
Yeah, I've worked with several of the different event like presenters and coordinators and stuff. The Denver one is definitely more of a more commercial one. And they essentially, what they did was they saw that another show was doing a lot more of these presentations again. And so he got, I don't know how they're doing it legally, but supposedly there's a crocodilian one and a venomous presentation. And I mean, while some people are allowed to actually transport and handle venomous snakes, like Rocky Mountain rattlesnakes,
right?
And I mean, you can't do it with alligators or crocodiles in Colorado. The only one you can legally transport, even if you have a USDA permit to keep them, are caiman. You can't transport any other ones. So I don't know how they're going to do it.
I don't know, but I reached out, I offered, and then I never heard back. So I just assumed they weren't interested in, like, I don't know what kind of presentations they're doing. Apparently live animal presentations then.
Well, you and I can talk a little bit more in depth about it, because that's essentially what I do. And I essentially have kind of like a fairly good working relationship with one of the ones.
Okay.
They have one in Pueblo. They have another one in Loveland. They're looking for one in the Springs area next year.
Okay, great.
But
I will also put out there, I said I don't like to travel. I don't, and I'm responsible for this huge animal sanctuary. So It's very difficult to get away. But I'm happy to do live stuff over Zoom or another format. Like I just did something for Reach Out Reptiles for their Retic Fest, and I just did it over Zoom, and I answered questions and everything, and I'm always happy to do that.
That's what we need to work on, but I don't get paid to do it, so I have a hard time investing in a lot of the tech and things like that, even though it would be very beneficial, because all I essentially find is someone to watch the house for the weekend, and I bring the animals in person. So I don't ever need that, but I know a lot of other people would absolutely benefit from that, but because I don't make any money doing it, I have a hard time shelling it out for essentially something that I will never use.
Well, I'm certainly happy to support you locally, so let me know about that if you need anything.
Oh yeah, we'll definitely talk. But with that being said, which a lot of people like to give me guff because I say that a lot, it's essentially a catchphrase I have at this point because I go on tangents. This was absolutely great, and I'm kind of like rushing the clock a little bit. I see the little timer counting down at the top. But this was amazing. I love to be able to talk about this stuff, and that's so cool. So for people listening and watching, because it's on YouTube and on different podcasts and stuff, I will put a link to all of your stuff down in the description of the video on YouTube. But if not, and they're listening, where can they find you and all of your information?
Behavioreducation.org is my website. All links to other things are there, like Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube. I have a YouTube channel. I'm really active on YouTube and Facebook, but I keep everything up to date on my website, behavioreducation.org.
Okay, cool. And then for your Facebook and YouTube, is it behavior education or is it Lori Torrini?
I have a personal Lori Torrini page on Facebook and a behavior education page on Facebook. Okay. And then YouTube is Lori Torrini Animal Behavior.
Okay. I know that a lot of people will search Facebook and YouTube first, and then they'll go to more official, better presented websites. And so that's why I always like to clarify a little bit.
Yeah. On YouTube, it's Lori Torrini Animal Behavior.
Perfect. So cool. This was absolutely amazing, and I love it. And honestly, I'm half considering setting up another little meeting where we can just continue to talk for a little while. Although I do hear my dogs barking on the other side of the building. Yeah,
started barking like 5 minutes ago.
Yep. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on and being able to share your knowledge and passion with me and anyone who will be listening in the future.
Thank you. I enjoyed it a lot.
All right. Thank you so much. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed today's episode. Look forward to hopefully more coming up soon. Still have a hard time tracking people down. But hey, thanks again so much. Hope everyone enjoyed it, and we will catch you next time.